Richard, it's good to have you back.
Thank you,
also
Jack.
good to have you back as a trustee, and we look forward to working with you.
Thanks.
You know, we're both old enough to remember the times when people would say, German unification, yeah, but not in my lifetime. It'll never happen. And then, bam, and you were there.
Yeah, I was there.
I want to ask you a little bit about where we are now, but reflect on that a little bit, because you were there at that moment.
Well, even before that, one of my most memorable experiences in life was in 1982, I think it was late 1982. Von Weizsäcker was governor, Richard von Weizsäcker.
He was the mayor, the governing mayor.
Governor-mayor of Berlin.
Yeah.
And I was over in Berlin, West Berlin. He took me by myself for reasons I still do not understand. He had an office that had a window that jutted out right to the Berlin Wall. It's all glass. And he picked me out alone. There was a group of us that had gone to his office, young people like Chuck Schumer, who was, and James Fallows and others. And for some reason, I got separated out. I think because I had gone to Oxford and he had gone to Balliol. He's a very formal man. And he took me up there, and we stood overlooking the wall, and he said, young man, someday this wall will be gone. I may not be here, but you will. And of course, he lived to see it happen.
Absolutely.
He was a lovely man, by the way, and a great orator. But how could you forget somebody of that finesse and that beauty at that moment? And this obviously is 1982. So that taught me a very valuable lesson. Deep in everybody's heart was reunifying families and Germany, and it wasn't going to go away.
And the other thing that I take away from that is never take anything for granted.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember when the wall finally did come down, Matthias Wiesmann, that day, I called him. I said, send me a piece of the wall, not one of these things they pretend is. So he actually got a real piece of the wall. It cost me a fortune to have it shipped to Dallas. I gave it to my son Anders, who was then just a college kid, and I wrote him a note saying, this will teach you of the power of the desire of people to be free. It's still framed in his living room now that he's given me grandchildren and is a successful businessman. That's one of his most treasured things.
It is. We've got one here too, and we put a wall piece over in front of SAIS, as you well know.
Right.
So let's ratchet forward. We get into unification. Cole says it's going to be flowering, serene. It took a little while to get there, and it's
you had an entire generation that you had to retool.
Well, that on the East German side.
Yeah.
Now, in the process of doing that, Germany became economically very strained. It became very difficult to know how long this was going to last. In the process of that, Germany became increasingly more central to Europe. You were not always uncritical of the way Germany handled things. But when you ratchet back and then say 1990 was then, 2015 is now, how have they done?
Well, I think they've done superbly well. Again, you had almost 2 full generations that got used to non-productivity and a non-market economy, and either had suppressed what they actually felt and lived in deep fear, or had succumbed to that lack of incentive. And it's not just what you see immediately after you cross through the Brandenburg Gate. That's the pretty part, up to Museum Island and so on. But the deeper you go, the harder it was. And this transition, it's almost like you have Dallas merging with Harlem in the old days when Harlem was totally dysfunctional and disincentivized. So I give them a gold star, an A+, because I really do think, first of all, it took a great deal of time. I don't think it's over. It takes a long time to undo the damage that's done to generations. And every time I see Putin now, I think of what his job was in East Germany. And the kind of people that subjected good German families to what they subjected them to.
And why
so
he's scared of that now in his own setting, what happened in Germany.
Of course.
Yeah.
I think he was scarred by that,
Mm-hmm.
the spontaneity of it.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, in retrospect, we now realize, given what happened in Poland and in the Czech Republic and others, then Czechoslovakia, it wasn't as spontaneous in Germany as, but it was there.
Public, yeah.
And anyway.
You were at some point, though, I remember vividly because I remember reading the speech, I wasn't there to see you give it, where you said, Germany, you've got to get your engines running.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to get up and stuff. Now, what caused you to give that speech at that time?
Well, what I actually said was, look, stop burying your ambition. The Second World War ended in that little red schoolhouse where the treaties were signed. And I felt it was important for Germany, and that was a very strong speech. You need to shed that shame, or whatever it is that still governs, and I'm talking about how you govern a good, well-oiled machine to make sure the speed is just right.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that governance mechanism was always staying in the back, staying in the back, staying in the back, creating this artificiality of what I believe is an artificiality of France being an equal partner.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that Angela Merkel is the perfect person, by the way, in that sense, to succeed Helmut Kohl. And I know there are criticisms, but the fact she was an East German, the fact that she has done what she's done, she's helped sustain part of the myth that France is an equal,
Mm-hmm.
but also treated France with great respect.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this new immigration issue is an interesting issue that goes back to bring out these ghosts from the past.
Right.
But the Germans that I know and the leaders, I've known every chancellor since Helmut Schmidt.
Well, let me ask you about one, Gerhard Schröder.
Right.
I mean, he is someone who say that he was the one who pushed 2010 with the agenda,
Right.
and therefore gave Merkel the running space that she's
Right.
been able to.
I think Schroeder did a good job.
You do?
I do.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't have to say it. Everybody was so caught up with his being a socialist and his mannerisms and his, by the way, closeness to Putin
Mm-hmm.
and Putin's wife
Mm-hmm.
and his friends. But in reality, he really paved the way for Angela Merkel. And for my criticism when I gave that speech, Jack, was about the need for structural change
Right.
and to get out there and achieve the efficiency that we all knew Germany had.
And they did.
Thanks in
Right.
part to Gerhard Schröder.
Right, exactly.
I thought his leadership was actually, in retrospect, quite good. I was never critical of him.
Mm-hmm.
I may not have agreed with his social philosophy. I'm not crazy about his closeness to Russians right now. But he made her possible.
I think that's part of the way that people look back retrospectively. He's been out of office since 2005. She's
Right.
been elected 3 times.
I know.
She's in the saddle. But let me ask you another question that's more contemporary. How do you think they dealt with the Greek crisis, and could they have done it better?
Well, Schäuble's a tough guy. And remember, he ran the internal intelligence services also. I mean, when you sit down with Schäuble, you realize he knows everything about you, including your telephone number and social security number. And, of course, you and I have no vices, so he doesn't know anything about our vices because we don't have any. But I'm always impressed at how disciplined he is. And there's also an underlying principle. You see it in the ECB, the European Central Bank. You see it in the European councils.
In the Bundesbank.
Well, the Bundesbank, of course, is the equivalent of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas in the Federal Reserve System.
Precisely.
I used to like to compare ourselves. In fact, the heads of the Bundesbank and I would have a great time together. We were sort of needles in the side of the central bank. But I understand where Germany's coming from. There are rules. It's a rule-based society. It's always been a rule-based society. Those rules were broken in entering because the Greeks lied about their statistics. And there are consequences. And Schäuble talked about consequences for bad behavior. Now, again, if you'd been to Athens and you saw what was written on the side of the central bank, they'd have swastikas and all that stuff.
Yeah.
This continues to be part of Germany's legacy.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you have to be very careful not to be driven by it. I mean,
That was your message back then, too.
That was my message
Yeah.
back then. Get over it.
Yeah.
And now you have to be clever in the way you lead through, but
Mm-hmm.
these are not Nazis anymore.
Mm-hmm.
This is a responsible, social democratic society that is the pivot point of Europe.
Do you think, you were not exactly a dove on the Federal Reserve, you were a hawk.
That's right. Doves are members of the pigeon family, by the way.
Okay.
Ornithologically speaking, and I wasn't going to be anybody's pigeon.
Well, you certainly weren't. But if you were hard on our side of the fence, which you were, you
Right.
were saying, you know, we can't do this something infinity thing.
Yeah, well, and we didn't have QE infinity.
And we didn't
Never
have
will.
any. But I mean, do you think that if you had been in the cockpit, either in Frankfurt at ECB, if you were Draghi, or if you were even in Berlin in some capacity, would there have been something you would have done differently than what they've done?
On reunification?
Well, no. I'm thinking about since 2009.
Well, but it's important to talk about
Okay, go
reunification
ahead.
because remember the parity of the currency was a big deal.
Right.
And there was no way the East German economy was equivalent in value
That's
to the West
a
German
given.
economy.
Yeah, I know.
So that was a purely political decision which took a long time to pay for
Right.
in that sense.
Right.
And I thought Helmut Kohl, that illustrated what Richard von Weizsäcker told me as a young man. This is driven by emotion as much as it is by anything else.
Sure.
You know, we cannot stand to be divided. Now, fast forward. If you talk about Greece, for example, this was harsh for those East Germans that had been subjected to Soviet rule. But they had to go through it. Now, there was leeway because they were fellow Germans. But the fact is they had to adjust.
Right.
And it hasn't been easy. A lot of older generation people you and I know never made the adjustment, just can't.
Right. They're still.
So again, you put that in the context of what Schäuble and Merkel have said about Greece.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the European Central Bank is concerned, they want to be, and they are, responsible in their leadership role within Europe. We know from watching our hapless Congress in the United States, which doesn't function this way, you have to compromise every now and then.
Yeah.
And I think this balance is very difficult to achieve. But you have the Latin societies. Greek is not quite Latin, obviously. It's a contradiction, but the Romans, the Spaniards, and so on. And then you have German discipline. And you're going to have to figure out a way to make the two work together.
Mm-hmm.
That's what Europe is all about. There were quite a few of our German friends, Jack, that didn't feel the euro was the first step. You had to get fiscal coordination.
Right.
And we're lucky that for all practical purposes, fiscal policy in Germany is well oiled and works well.
Mm-hmm.
But there are over a dozen other countries where it does not work in Europe.
Yeah.
So you got to have somebody, in a way, who plays the Thatcher role, which is the
Interesting
nagging
comparison.
nanny.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's Germany.
Okay. And they have to, that's an interesting point you make, because I've often said to my German friends, because of the fact that they become so centrally important, and quite frankly, the de facto leader of Europe.
They are the de facto
I
leader
say
of
to
Europe.
them, welcome to the club. You're going to take a lot of sticks and hits by virtue of that role. And we have...
Leadership is
never...
never...
About that. We got scars up and down our arms.
Leadership is never easy.
Right, but they're not, that was the problem, wasn't it? I mean, Germany evolving into a sense of actually aspiring to leadership. That was always a word, that was a little bit of a...
Verboten, yeah.
Yeah. I remember, for example, when George Herbert Walker Bush gave that speech in Mainz in 1989, where he said partnership and leadership, and the Germans said, oh my goodness.
Right.
You know, well, now, 25 years later, they are leaders in partnership, don't you think?
No, they're clearly leaders. They are the standard by which other people set themselves.
With all of the difficulties that comes with that.
Yeah, it's a huge burden.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing, I've met Angela Merkel twice, when she came to the United States, and previous to that, when we opened the Jewish Museum in Berlin. And, you know, in a way she has the right, this is a personal view, obviously, the right temperament to handle it. She's a workhorse. And she isn't a Margaret Thatcher in the sense that she doesn't lecture everybody else except for when she gets into the Bundestag or her own cabinet
That's her
meetings.
right.
That's her right. She's the chancellor.
Yeah.
But she in terms of Europe, you have a tough guy in Schäuble,
Mm-hmm.
and then you have a sort of a mitigator in the chancellor. I think
Facilitator.
yeah,
Right?
it's a nice combination.
Tell me something finally now, though, when you look at Germany and then you turn your gaze back to the United States. And when in '89 we were going to help this happen, the Germans were enormously grateful to the United States.
That's right.
There's been a lot of, shall we say, dissidence in the last several years, not only on the NSA stuff, but also on economic approaches to things.
Right.
Where do you think we have changed in the way that we look at Germany? Or let me put it this way, where should we have changed when we look at Germany in 2015?
Well, we've had the pivot to the Far East.
Right.
That's understandable. China's a rising power, still has a lot of issues they have to resolve. And we have less government resources than we had before, which are more tightly managed. We still have the most innovative, successful economy in the history of the world, and every time people count us out, Professor Kennedy at Yale saying it's going to be the European century, or Japan is number one, or China, 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 we emerge as the lead. We're like, I like to compare us to Secretariat at Belmont in 1973.
Oh my goodness.
We are so many lengths ahead of everybody else. Okay. And, or in times of weakness, as I used to say during the crisis, we're still the best looking horse in the glue factory. But now that the glue factory is no longer and these guys are actually galloping around the track, we're way ahead. Unfortunately, my personal feeling, and this may be my generation, I don't think it's either or. I think we need to set the standard for being good, cooperative, global leaders together on both sides of the east of the United States and the west of the United States, the Pacific and the Atlantic. And unfortunately, we don't set a good example. We have a feckless Congress. We've had weak executive leadership, particularly the last few years. I am totally nonpartisan. I went to the Fed. I checked my politics at the door. I was a Democrat before that. But I'm very, very disappointed in this example we show to, again, let's go back to two key figures. What does Schäuble really think of the President of the United States? What does the Chancellor really think? She has to deal with a Bundestag and a Bundesrat, but still of the Congress of the United States. We look like we can't even tie our shoelaces. Right. These people are trying to lead a new experiment called Europe, and at the same time affect unification still, and making for the most efficient production machine in all of Europe, which is Germany. So I'm afraid we don't set a very good example, and that worries me. And if you don't set a good example, you're not respected. And then if you say, I'm going to pivot elsewhere, and by the way, not do that very well, you know, I must say, if I were the Chancellor of Germany, or if I were one of her senior advisors like Schäuble, I'd be worried about the United States. Except suddenly we lead the world energy revolution. Suddenly we lead the technology revolution. Right. There's an amazing something here that allows entrepreneurialism to take grip and prosper. And you don't find that in Germany. You do not find that in Europe.
That's right.
You don't find it in Asia to the degree you do here.
That's correct. I mean, they swarm in here to Washington, and increasingly you get on the next plane and go out to the Valley.
Yeah.
And it's not just the Valley. It's down where you live in
no,
Texas.
Absolutely.
It's
we see them in Austin. We see them in Palo Alto. We see them up in Route 128 for bio stuff in Boston.
So let me capsulize and conclude by...
Although we see German discounters going into Arkansas, by the way.
Well, that's okay.
Aldi is in there trying to eat, you know, Walmart's lunch. So
Aldi is
they actually have Aldi actually has a store right downtown.
Yeah.
In the headquarters of Walmart.
Good for them.
I know. It's just punch them in the nose.
In the end, though, I think that what we're talking about is the fact that in the work that you did, and I assume the Fed worked hand in glove with Draghi, and you guys were constantly talking to each other.
Well, particularly the chairs, they talked to each other. And Draghi used to call me over a lot to ask me about and his predecessor, by the way, who was a Frenchman who had to become a German to be successful. Yeah. They couldn't understand all the productivity in Texas and why we were creating so many jobs. So I admire Draghi, and I admired his predecessor.
But you guys were fairly well linked, and there's a lot of discussion, I think, now in this town with some people who pay attention to Europe that say, we've got a lot of good governmental links. Obviously, the Congress is dysfunctional. I agree with you on that.
Right.
But the real problem I think that we're going to have, or challenge, let's put it this way, is that we need a narrative between the two countries that's going to say why we need each other in 2015, which is very different when you stood on the steps of the Brandenburg Gate in 1990.
That's right.
I think we need a new narrative about what it is that makes the glue of what we need each other for.
Right.
And that, I think, begins with the work that you did at the Federal Reserve. It begins with the Valley. It begins with the kind of practical problems that we share. It isn't about care packages anymore. It isn't
No,
about
this
what
isn't
the
the Berlin airlift.
Yeah,
this
it's
is
nothing
a
about-
sophisticated exercise between two very sophisticated societies.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
And I think that often does contribute to some frictions, clearly.
Yeah.
But I would always say the sum is always greater than its parts. And we've got a lot of parts.
You know, there's
moving parts.
there's one aspect that I think we don't do enough on. Germany's gotten better and better on the higher education front.
Uh-huh.
We still are the leaders of higher education in
Right.
the United States.
Right.
We should be doing more together on that front.
Okay.
And I think that's easily done. We have some great technical institutes in Germany. We have universities now that are becoming great universities in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And they should be working with the Harvards and the Stanfords and the... by the way, I'm an overseer at Harvard. I hate to lose Niall Ferguson and other professors to Stanford, but these are the great universities in the United States, and we have so many of them.
And one of them is Hopkins, of course. And
Hopkins is a great university, and of course has this historical legacy.
Right.
And this is where the AICGS
That's
comes from.
where it all comes together. And
So
that's why
I think we should be doing more in higher education.
Okay. We'll take that as our next 2016 job, but we appreciate
Good for
it.
you.
Thank you for being here again.
Thank you, Jack.
Okay.